Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition and we turn to poem 412, I Read My Sentence Steadily. Now, here we're back to the idea of Emily getting bad news. Some have seen this as another theodicy, that question of why must there be pain or suffering in this world and how do we deal with it? Some have called it that emotional crisis of 1862 that will somehow frame so many of the poems that Emily will write during this time. It's clear that in this poem she feels judged in some way. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments, and I'm hopeful that you've worked through our preceding 411 poems. We just finished with 411, The Color of the Grave is Green. Now, we know that there's a whole bunch of different interpretations of these poems that we study. Scholars have different views. The scholar Ruth Miller will say that the sentence, or suggest that the sentence that Emily is reading steadily is a verdict that was contained in an article published in the Springfield Republican written by her great friend Samuel Boyles and was titled, What Should We Write? And it contained several words. Quote, this is again Boyles. There is another kind of writing only too common. It may be called the literature of misery. The writers are chiefly women, gifted women maybe, full of thought and feeling and fancy, but poor, lonely, and unhappy. Also, that suffering is so seldom healthful. It may be a valuable discipline in the end, but for the time being, it too often clouds, withers, distorts. We would say to our suffering friends, write not from the fullness of a present sorrow. Ordinarily, the lacerated bosom must first be healed before it can gladden other natures with the overflowings of a healthful life. Now, Miller, end quote, by the way, Miller will think that Emily read this and she had to have been somehow disturbed by it because she had been sending a number of her poems to that very Sam Boyles. This is how she says it. I read my sentence steadily, reviewed it with my eyes to see that I made no mistake in its extreme clause, the date and manner of the shame, and then the pious form that God have mercy on the soul the jury voted him. I made my soul familiar with her extremity, that at the last it should not be a novel agony, but she and death acquainted, meet tranquilly as friends, salute and pass without a hint, and there the matter ends. Now, the way that the poem ends, the matter ends, that very kind of stoic type of a response is one I think worth our time. Notice, I read my sentence steadily. In other words, the death sentence. Reviewed it. Notice we go from reviewing to familiar to acquainted. Reviewed it with my eyes to see that I made no mistake. Now, again, I think Miller is arguing Emily had to have read through this article that Sam Boyles wrote a number of times, feeling possibly indicted with the idea of the poetry of misery, to see that I made no mistake in its extremist clause. Notice from sentence to clause, the date, the manner of the shame. Now, Emily uses the word shame in 16 different poems. We don't know what the shame obviously is or the source of it. Maybe one of her most famous poems about shame is 1412. We'll come back to this poem when we get there. Shame is the shawl of pink in which we wrap the soul to keep it from infesting eyes, the elemental veil which helpless nature drops when pushed upon a scene repugnant to her probity. Shame is the tent divine. It is interesting that she uses the word shame, and then, notice capitalized, the pious form that God have mercy on the soul. Obviously, the death sentence as it's read by a judge after a jury has proclaimed that the individual must be executed. God have mercy on the soul. The jury voted him. And again, the use of the word jury, I think, does help Ruth Miller's argument. In other words, the jury is out, but has been out, but now it's in, and Sam Boyles believes my writing to be lesser than. And she's wounded by it. I made my soul familiar with her extremity. Notice the use again of the juxtaposition of the soul, sounding very much, as we've said, like Whitman. And then at the last, it should not be a novel agony. You remember agony from 241. We love that. We love that unusual phrasing. I like a look of agony because I know it's true. Men do not sham convulsion. Notice sham and shame so close as a word. Nor simulate a throe. The eyes glaze once, and that is death, impossible to feign. The beads upon the forehead by homely anguish strung. Emily is in many ways the poet of agony, no doubt. She wanted it not to be unusual, a novel agony, but she and death acquainted meet tranquilly. We think of this word acquainted, don't we, in Frost's Acquainted with the Night. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. Notice, meet tranquilly as friends. In other words, you grapple with a situation that's really hard to live with, and then you kind of become friends to the whole situation. Salute and pass without a hint. In other words, showing not at all that you've been somehow affected. And there, the matter ends. The Stoic ideal, right? I thought it through, and I will not allow for this to affect me. And yet, of course, we have the poem. What is the message here at 2A? I think some bad things you just have to let go. You can't. The matter ends. You can't deal with it in any other way. At 2B, the language of the court is interesting here because Emily's father obviously was a lawyer, and she knew this language. At 3A, though, I want to take you to Matthew 27, and I think that standing behind this poem is Emily's thinking about the trial of Christ and how unfair it was, and yet Christ had to just accept it and in the end go to his final execution. I think Emily is some way identifying, we've said this before, identifying with the Christ figure, the persecuted, the misunderstood, the judged, if you will. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, what was a time when you had to accept that some suffering, at least, was just the way that it was, and there was really nothing you could do about it? Thank you.